Hello, welcome back. Today we will talk about the relationship between human well-being and social justice. We will introduce you to some basic concepts of political theory, especially in the Western political tradition. So, let's get started. So why do we talk about justice? What is justice and what is the practical purchase of debates about what is or isn't just? Well, I think one recent story may illuminate these questions. In March of 2020, a video of Lauren Whitney, a 36-year-old mother of four, went viral. Lauren lives in Washington, Utah, and in the video voiced significant distress because of her inability to find diapers for her baby during the early part of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, according to the New York Times article a few days later, experts say that the issue is not with the supply of these baby essentials. It's that some Americans are hoarding the available stock, right? And later on, a professor of management said that, especially with diapers and baby formulas, it's pretty similar to what we were seeing with toilet papers and hand sanitizers and things like that, right? So in the video, Lauren said, "How am I supposed to find diaper for my child if I can afford to buy 20 at a time like other people can," right? So I think this story highlights, among many other things, that the coronavirus pandemic affects different people differently. While wealthier families could afford to panic buy supplies, right, low-income families are left in the dust often, and leading to unnecessary suffering of many mothers and infants who are in great need of these supplies. And so justifiably, many in the United States and around the world are morally indignant, right, at scenarios like this. And so questions of social justice are raised. Some of the questions may be, does the way our institutions are organized do justice to human dignity and need, right? Do our laws, practices, and values reflect our obligations to one another as a political community? So the questions we're raising here are questions about social justice, right? They concern the norms, pattern, practices, as well as values that organize our common life together. So it is the job of a theory of social justice to help us recognize these patterns of injustice and to discern how to address injustice especially using a very limited amount of collective resources, right? So when these questions are asked in relation to human health and well-being, we are doing bioethics, right? Within bioethics, we have clinical as well as social ethics. But in this course, bioethics in society, we try to focus on the public health dimensions of bioethics. As we have read, not every kind of human inequality is an issue of justice, right? Some inequalities, such as that of differences between cities that experience more serious earthquakes, right, versus those that do not experience many natural disasters, these are not morally relevant inequalities because these are caused by sort of natural phenomena, right? Others, however, such as how we respond to natural disasters as a nation, right, especially for areas that don't have as much resources as others. Now, that is a question. That is a scenario where social justice questions can be raised. So it is part of the practical relevance or purchase of theories of justice, precisely to help us figure out which inequalities matter and which matter more than others, and thus warranting the use of our collective scarce resources to address. So before moving forward, a few things should be said about theories of justice. We should take note that there are actually many schools of thought in political philosophy, but insofar as this course is concerned, we're limiting our discussion to Western political traditions. And in particular, we're focusing on the dominant school of thought in Western political thought that is called political liberalism, right? The word liberalism here is used as a technical term, right? So it's not to be confused with how mainstream political discourse distinguishes between, say, political liberals versus political conservatives. It's not about that at all. Here we're using liberal as a technical term. And by liberal, political theorists mean a school of thought that takes political liberties, right, individual liberty, moral equality, as well as the separation between church and state very seriously. Now, this last thing follows from the belief that political institutions should not impose a particular way of life on the people, right? So, different political liberals put different emphasis on liberty and equality, right? They might also disagree on what autonomy or equality actually entail in practice. Nonetheless, the dominant school of political liberalism is Rawlsian liberalism. That is the form of political liberalism that is developed by the philosopher John Rawls, which combines features of both social contract theories and Kantian moral philosophy. So what is the social contract tradition? Well, social contract theories imagine societies to be the result of individuals who don't have any prior social bond, cooperating for the sake of mutual advantage or mutual benefit. In other words, society for social contract theories is like any other kind of contract, whereby people come together in order to achieve things that would otherwise not be possible, which in this case is human survival and basic human flourishing, right? So individuals make the choice to cooperate in society because there are things that we all need from one another. So this sounds pretty intuitive and commonsensical, right? You probably have heard of the term the social contract, either from the media or in everyday conversations. But can you also see some potential problems and drawbacks about the central assumptions of social contract? So if society is a contract for mutual advantage or mutual gain, then it assumes that everyone is more or less equally capable in terms of strength, intelligence, and health. After all, it would really make no sense for us to contract with people who would not be able to contribute as much as we can, or people who would not be able to reciprocate, right? So for example, the seriously sick, children, weaker people, those who are seriously mentally or physically disabled, right, are people who are often ignored by social contract theory, if not outright excluded, right? Because on social contract grounds alone, without additional normal moral limits, there will be no problem for the weaker people to be dominated or even enslaved by the strong and the capable, right? Or even to be excluded from the social contract altogether, which historically has been used in many of these ways. So this is why social contract theories historically conceived of the purpose of government to be primarily about the protection of property and not really about the protection of human dignity or the advancement of human well-being. So it seems that it's not enough to just assume that society is the product of a contract that is done for the sake of mutual advantage, right? Something else must be at work in order to avoid some of these consequences that we would not accept, right? So here's where the Kantian notion of human dignity comes in, right? Which is an idea that is very consistent with Jewish and Christian traditions of human dignity, right? So not only are we contracting with one another for mutual advantage, we also have to do so in ways that respect the equal worth and dignity of every person, so that no one is arbitrarily sacrificed for the interest of another person, right? So this is kind of very intuitive idea within the Western political tradition that each of us have rights that ensures that our interests are not sacrificed for the sake of some other group or the tyranny of the majority and things like that, right? And Immanuel Kant is one of the first modern philosophers to put this moral intuition in a very pithy formula, right? For him, persons should be treated not merely as means, but also as ends in themselves. What this means is that we should not use other people as merely objects of our manipulation, right? We should also treat other people with respect. We should treat other people as if they are agents in their own right? They have their own interests, their own desires, their life plan, which we should honor, right? So in a lot of ways, though, human dignity pushes against or comes into tension with the social contract idea that the society is for the sake of individual benefit, right? Because the idea of human dignity seems to presuppose that we're not only concerned about gaining some kind of advantage from our cooperation, but we're actually concerned about each other in a moral way, right? We're concerned about each other's human dignity, freedom, and well-being. So this moral idea comes into some tension with the other central assumption of the social contract tradition, namely that human beings are mutually disinterested individuals who just so happens to cooperate with each other for the sake of mutual gain, right? Like a market transaction. So something deeper is at work here. But nonetheless, even if the social contract model of societies is problematic in a lot of ways, I believe that the central intuition that society should try to do justice to everyone's interests is something that is worth preserving. So Martha Nussbaum, who is one of the most important and greatest political philosophers of our time, argues that it is pretty arbitrary for modern political traditions, right, to favor thinking about people primarily as self-interested and mutually disinterested individuals. Because if we look at older traditions, especially in the Western political tradition, we see that in the Aristotelian tradition, in the Roman Stoic tradition, that of Cicero, for instance, medieval traditions, Augustinian political thought, and the thought of Thomas Aquinas, right, as well as early modern thinkers such as Grotius, right. All of these different thinkers and traditions always assume that human beings naturally belong to communities. We are born into communities, and so we're indebted to communities, right? And that we're naturally sociable, right? We're naturally social creatures. And so Aristotle said that we are political animals. Human beings are political animals. So it was always assumed that human beings can only live in a dignified and a flourishing way in community with other people and governed by political institutions. So Nussbaum prefers to think of society not as a system of cooperation for mutual benefit, but as a system of human cooperation through which all of us can secure the basic conditions of a decent human life, right? So this approach presupposes that we're morally interested in other people's well-being, unlike the social contract tradition, right? So, and this approach to social justice has come to be known as the capabilities approach. So Madison Powers and Ruth Faden's theory is one compelling version that situated within this broader capabilities approach tradition, right? So today we talk about some fundamental features of their theory of justice and how it builds on and is different from other well-known models of justice. So for Powers and Faden, justice is fundamentally concerned about human well-being, right? And now, this already sets them apart from other contemporary theories of justice. As we will see, there are 6 irreducible dimensions of human well-being that are of great importance to questions about how we organize our social life together. For Powers and Faden, these 6 dimensions are irreducible because each of them cannot be subsumed under other dimensions. They all are important in their own right? They cannot be easily traded off, for instance. So, however, these different 6 dimensions, even though they're irreducible and are all important in their own right, they still interpenetrate one another in very important ways, right? Such that when even one of the 6 dimensions is seriously compromised, they lead to other dimensions being compromised as well, right? So these 6 dimensions are chosen because for Powers and Faden, these are features that if any human life is seriously deficient in one or more of these, it is likely that a person is not experiencing a sufficient level of human well-being or flourishing, right? And furthermore, this is true regardless of whatever a person's particular life plans and personal commitments are. So let's take a look at the first dimension of human well-being, health. So for Powers and Faden, health captures dimensions of human flourishing that is frequently expressed through the biological or organic functioning of the body. While health is a state or condition that can be described in organic or functional terms, the absence of health refers to more than biological malfunctioning or impairments to some functional ability, such as sight or hearing, right? And so health includes pain management, mental and emotional health, as well as sexual health. So for Powers and Faden, health is just one dimension of human well-being among others, and so that not every dimension of human well-being can be subsumed under the category of health, right? So this shows that Powers and Faden is committed to what we call a pluralistic understanding of human well-being, that there's more than one dimension and they cannot be subsumed under each other easily, right? So to give you an example, genital mutilation, for instance, is not just a health issue, right? It is a health issue, but it's also an issue about social respect, right? Whether or not we respect women, right? In contexts where genital mutilation is practiced. It is also an issue of personal security, right? So these two things, respect and security, are also important dimensions of human well-being. That is not necessarily that is not subsumed under the category of health, because they're a little bit different from health, though related to health. So to reduce these other issues to health is to miss in important ways why genital mutilation, for instance, should be considered morally problematic, right? But health in itself is a very complex category, because we often have to decide, for instance, between morbidity, right, quality of life, and mortality, the risk of dying. We also have to critically assess complex medical trade-offs between, for instance, personal taste, mental health, and mobility. And the second dimension of human well-being is personal security, right? So torture and physical emotional abuse and an unsafe working environment are widely recognized as basic human rights violations, right? Now, these things not only harm the body in terms of our physical and emotional health, but they also undermine social respect, right? But they also, in a huge, important way, undermine the ability of anyone to live a decent human life, right? That a decent human life has to be free from these kinds of threats, right? So someone who is constantly threatened by all kinds of things is really not living a decent human life. So safety deserves independent consideration as a dimension of human well-being. So the philosopher Aristotle is well known to have made the distinction between, on the one hand, theoretical reason, and on the other, practical reason, right? So theoretical reasoning has to do with our knowledge and belief about what is real, right? It concerns the empirical dimension of human cognitive reasoning, as well as the ability to theorize and to make abstract connections between things, right? So theoretical reason is, in short, our ability to comprehend and to understand the world in which we live, right? So theoretical reasoning is not just important for learning about things in school or to learning about things to acquire a skill, for instance, but they're important in a very basic way that enables us to function properly in our day-to-day life, right? If we are unable to distinguish between the truth, reality from falsehood, for instance, right, then our ability to function properly in life would be undermined. Now, on the other hand, practical reasoning has to do with the ability to make evaluative judgments, right, about how to live our lives. So it is our ability to think morally about our actions as well as our relationship with each other, right? It allows a person to think critically about her ideas, values, beliefs, as well as actions. Now, practical reason is something that we don't always think about, but it is also very essential to living a moral life, right? Um, and to be able to sustain lasting and fulfilling relationships. So these cognitive abilities do not simply depend on our biology, right? Although biology is important, but they are also based on social determinants, such as education and our social class and our environment. Environmental factors also have a huge influence over whether or not we develop our cognitive abilities properly. Culture, for instance, may be another thing that could either promote or undermine learning, right? If we have a lot of public intellectuals or experts who are engaged in a disinformation campaign, then our collective ability to discover the truth would be undermined, as well as our collective ability to make important public decisions. And another important dimension of human well-being is respect, right? For Powers and Faden, they say at minimum, respect for others involves treatment of others as dignified moral beings, deserving of equal moral concern, right? Respect for others as others requires an ability to see others as independent sources of moral worth and dignity, and to view others as appropriate objects of sympathetic identification. Now, this is very much in line with the larger political liberal tradition of moral equality, right? This kind of respect is called recognition respect because it's based on our ability to sympathetically identify with other moral agents, right? And to be able to treat them with respect and dignity. This is different. Sometimes it's confused with what's called appraisal respect, right? Appraisal respect has to do with our achievements and accomplishments. So someone who is a great scholar or a great doctor or a great dentist deserves certain recognition because of what they have achieved, right? That's different from recognizing every person as morally equal or as equally worthy of our moral concern, right? Just because we're morally concerned in another person doesn't mean that we also acknowledge or reprove of what they do, right? So appraisal respect versus recognition respect are very different. Now, some ways that respect can be undermined would be discrimination based on a person's group identification, right? Being a person of a certain race or gender or social class can, in many contexts, cause somebody to be discriminated against, right? And when that does happen, it constitutes an assault on the dignity of that person, right? Because it's a failure of recognition, respect, right? And so a social group, though, as philosopher Iris Marion Young defines, is any collective of persons that is differentiated by at least one other group, by either cultural forms, practices, and ways of life, right? So somebody can be discriminated against based on not only their race and gender, but also by their ethnicity, by their culture, by the way they dress, and so on, right? And groups can also emerge as a result of common historical experiences, right? But when people are discriminated against based on group identification, it undermines their self-respect, right? If you're a child who belongs to a member of a group who is historically discriminated against, that also has huge psychological implications, right? And once you suffer these types of disrespect in our environment, in our culture, it's extremely difficult later on to feel good about yourself, to develop self-respect, right? So even though it's not impossible, it becomes extremely difficult. So this is another way that social determinants can also undermine our self-respect and self-esteem based on the lack of respect we have experienced as people. And another dimension of human well-being is attachment, right? Human beings are not isolated individuals, but they form bonds of attachment with fellow human beings, right? Maybe even with animals, in terms of friendship, romantic relationships, and other forms of communities. Philosopher Emmanuel Levinas stresses that it's our encounter with another person from infancy to adulthood that makes the human world possible, right? Culture, ethics, knowledge is all made possible because of our bonds with one another. So the ability to form bonds of compassion, solidarity, and emotional investment is the bedrock of human civilization and human flourishing, right? Culture and societies wouldn't be possible without human bonds. So the lack of such bonds then really, is especially damaging for children, right? Now, this can sometimes lead to manifestations of aggressive and antisocial behavior in children. So the lack of such bonds makes social cooperation, not only makes social cooperation difficult, but also undermines human flourishing. So failure to establish sympathetic bonds is also the root of, I think, a lot of ways, political polarization and discrimination, right? So attachment directly impinges on respect as an important dimension of human well-being. So earlier we talked about how these different dimensions interpenetrate, right? This is one way that, attachment can directly impact respect. Standard political theories, as we talked about earlier in the social contract tradition, such as and that of John Rawls, tended to look at people as individuals who are mutually disinterested, right? But nonetheless, we cooperate because we need each other. We need to gain something from one another. Now, this way of looking at human beings, I think, betrays an individualistic bias in so much of Western political theory and social imagination, right? Some people have observed, right, that this is really an artificial construct. Because the truth is, relationships really precede individuals, right? As I think Emmanuel Levinas is correct to make that argument. We are born into and nurtured by social networks, and we retain our dependence on other people throughout our entire lives, right? We don't ever become completely independent from other people, right? So independence and dependence are really just a matter of degree. So Powers and Faden correctly takes an approach that assumes human beings are interdependent, that we need to care for each other, we have mutual responsibilities, and we also have vulnerabilities. So social arrangements can either foster or undermine human attachment. It is also important to talk about self-determination as an important dimension of human well-being. Now, those of us who are familiar with the Western tradition, this is one of the most important things. If we learn about bioethics and clinical ethics, autonomy is a huge thing in the Western world, Western societies. So throughout the history of political philosophy, especially here in the West, there have been many arguments for why we need self-determination, right? Which is usually understood to be human beings having certain basic political liberties that ensure certain aspects of our lives are not arbitrarily interfered with by either governments or other individuals. Sometimes political liberties are construed as having merely instrumental value, right? Such as that it furthers other interests, such as our ability to fulfill a variety of life plans, ideals, or the discovery of truth. But for some people in the Western political tradition, such as John Stuart Mill and Isaiah Berlin, they both believe that self-determination is morally significant in its own right, right? It's not just an instrumental good, but it's also important in its own right. Because they argue that in general, even if we live a pretty healthy life, right, and we have all a basic level of all the other dimensions of human well-being that we talked about earlier, I think we would still feel that our life is diminished or not a decent life if we completely lack control over how the course of our lives go, right? That we don't get to choose our career, we don't get to practice our religion freely. I think something is seriously wrong with that, right? So I think Mill and Berlin are correct insofar as they believe that self-determination is an important dimension of human well-being, right? As we know from research, people who feel a sense of control over their own lives generally have better psychological well-being, right, as well as physical well-being. So, but on the other hand, self-determination also requires social institutions, right? Requires basic space of liberty to be honored, right? We need to have laws that protect individual liberty. We need to have legal institutions, law enforcement institutions that protect people's freedom, basic freedoms. And he also, on the other, and this is something sometimes people don't think about, is self-determination also requires certain basic capacities, such as we talked about earlier, theoretical reasoning and practical reasoning, right? If we don't know what is true, if we lack the ability to think morally, then we also would not really have the ability to determine ourselves, right? To really make decisions about what we want to do in an informed way. So in medical ethics, we'll talk about informed consent. It depends on a particular kind of situation, and it depends on basic human capacities that can be developed through education and so on, and relationships. And so, so that self-determination is not just a freestanding capacity that everybody just happens to have, but it actually also requires social institutions in order to nurture, right? So that I think Rousseau is correct. Without certain basic material conditions, people are not really genuinely free. So because Powers and Faden's theory is based on a particular understanding of human well-being, right? It can be characterized as a form of what we call essentialism, right? That it is an image, it's a theory about human nature, basically, right? And it's a little bit, however, it's important to distinguish their essentialism from traditional kinds of essentialism that could be considered to be morally problematic by many political liberals in the Western tradition, right? For instance, if we think about Aristotle in the West, Confucius in the East, right? Or Aquinas and Augustine in the medieval period, they all make very strong claims about what the good life actually looks like, right? For instance, a good life is defined by community, the worship of God, and the cultivation of faith, hope, and love in the Christian tradition, right? According to Augustine and Aquinas. So back in their time, they believed that society must be designed to cultivate these Christian virtues and Christian faith. And it has the authority to punish heretics, right? Or people who have departed from the Christian faith. However, I think most political philosophers in the West rightly have rejected this very strong alliance between political society and a particular version of the good life, right? Because it can very quickly become very oppressive if we force people to practice a particular religion or to become a particular kind of people. So contemporary liberal models of society tend to move in the opposite direction of rejecting any attempt to define the parameters of a decent human life because they're afraid of tyranny and totalitarianism. Now, this was a good reason to reject all of that. However, a lot of the Western traditions move too far in the other direction too, right? That, to the point where political ethics is then grounded in just individualistic concerns, where we're just here to gain mutual advantage, right? As you can see in the social contract tradition. And a lot of people have come to recognize that that conception of social life is inadequate, right? And there really is no theory of justice that doesn't make some kind of assumption about what the decent human life is like, including theories about political liberties, right? There is some concept of, a decent life is one that has basic political liberties. So then the middle ground between a very thick traditional understanding of the human life, human good, versus a completely agnostic account of the human good is what's called moderate essentialism, right? A moderate essentialism does not tell us how we should live. It merely gives us a general account of some fundamental features of life, without which life would be seriously deficient, right? Whatever our life plans may be, right? So there is still a strong and genuine emphasis on self-determination, but it still tells us what are some of the basic conditions that makes a life decent. So in other words, modern kinds of moderate essentialism concerns only those features of well-being that people would reasonably desire. And it doesn't matter what kinds of life plans you have. And these basic aspects of well-being should be nurtured by social institutions. Right? So this puts Powers and Faden in the liberal camp, of political philosophy. Again, to be a liberal is to be committed to these ideals of moral equality, political liberties, and the separation of church and state, right? But it moves them a little bit towards the Aristotelian tradition in terms of wanting to really identify certain basic features of human flourishing. Powers and Faden's theory is also called a non-ideal political theory. This means that their theory is does not follow the same procedures of many other political philosophers like John Rawls, who believe that it is the task of a theory of justice to come up with principles of justice and principles of just distribution in the abstract through thought experiments like the veil of ignorance. So let's dwell a little bit on the veil of ignorance. What is the veil of ignorance? Well, it's kind of a thought experiment that he invites his readers to go through, right? So imagine yourself, all of us, standing behind a veil of ignorance. When you stand behind a veil, it magically removes your knowledge about a number of things about yourself. You don't know what your race is. You don't know what your social class is. You don't know what your gender is. You don't know your age. You have no idea what your income is. You have no idea what your wealth is. And you don't even have any idea what your natural talents or endowments would be, right? You don't even know what your religion is. So really, behind a veil of ignorance, you understand yourself to have the possibility to be anyone in society, right? So what is this for? Well, the veil of ignorance is a thought experiment that help us to get into place where we can come up with principles of justice, rules and laws that govern a society that is completely impartial and completely fair, right? So if we don't know what our race is, what our gender is, what our socioeconomic class is, we're more likely, according to Rawls, to come up with rules that can be justified to everyone in society. So basically, for Rawls, there are two principles that emerges from that veil of ignorance, right? So once all of us step behind the veil of ignorance, we would basically agree to two principles of justice. The first one is that each person has to have some strong claim to a scheme of equal political liberties, right? Such as freedom of speech and things like that, which is compatible with the freedom of all to have these liberties. So all of us would have a basic scheme of basic civil liberties that protects us from the arbitrary interference of both government and other people, right? So that's the first thing we would agree to if we all stand behind a veil of ignorance. Now, the second principle of justice is, I think, more interesting. It says that social and economic inequalities are just only if it satisfies two conditions. Remember, behind the veil of ignorance, you have no idea what your social class is. You don't know what your talents are, and you don't know what your income is. So if you're standing behind that veil of ignorance and you're trying to design a society, for Rawls, the rules you would consider fair is that economic inequalities are justifiable only on these two conditions. One, inequalities must not undermine everyone's equal opportunity to positions and offices within that society, right? So everyone must have a fair chance to basically make a good living, right? To be a participant in their society. So they can't be discriminated against based on their race or gender and things like that. So basic equality of opportunity is the first of the second principle of justice. The first dimension of the second principle of justice. Now, the second principle is called the difference principle. And it basically says that inequalities are justifiable only insofar as it leads to some benefit to the least advantage to the least advantaged members of society, right? So inequality is justifiable basically only if it benefits the least advantage in society. Because again, behind a veil of ignorance, you have no idea who you would be once the veil is lifted. So of course, you would only want to be in a society whereby the poorest of the poor somehow benefits from the inequalities that exist. Otherwise, you would consider the inequalities unjustifiable, right? So these two Rawlsian principles, I think, especially the principle about political liberties and principle of equal opportunity, really does speak to the basic moral intuitions behind Western political and legal institutions. So I think what is carried forward in both Powers Faden's approach as well as Martha Nussbaum's approach is the development and the reinterpretation of what equality of opportunity means, right? So for Nussbaum, Powers, and Faden, equality of opportunity entails equality of access to basic dimensions of human well-being and capabilities. As we'll talk about it next week, for many of these different dimensions of human well-being, what matters is not simply whether or not people have the opportunity to achieve them, but whether or not people have them in the first place, right? So human well-being is a little bit different from Rawlsian understanding of equal opportunity because they're not about particular jobs or positions in society, right? They're not about giving everyone sort of, in principle, some possibility of making it in society. But for Nussbaum, Powers, and Faden, what we need to worry about is not so much just the opportunities people have, but also whether or not they can achieve a basic level of human well-being. The reason for that is, as we will see, if any of these dimensions of well-being is undermined, it also effectively undermines their opportunity to achieve a decent human life, right? And sometimes it happens before you have the ability to make choices. So for instance, a child who does not have any opportunity to develop attachment, bonds with parents, don't really get a good education, don't really feel respected, and don't have really access to good health care, then that child would lack the basic conditions for her to then advance later on in life, or to even have a real opportunity to achieve a basic threshold of human flourishing, right? So for Faden, Nussbaum, and Powers, outcome and opportunities are not always easily separated, because sometimes outcome will come to haunt us later on by undermining our opportunities. So Powers and Faden believe that theories of justice should address not only sort of hypothetical situations like the one that is set out by Rawls, but also needs to address concrete situations, right? In this particular context, within this community, do people actually have the ability to achieve a basic level or threshold of human well-being? So this is what makes their theory a non-ideal theory, because it wants to deal with the actual conditions of people's lives and to see whether or not we need to correct certain structural problems in order for people to actually have opportunities to flourish, right? So, but the situation, of course, is complex, so it also depends on empirical analysis, which is why we will be spending a lot of time in this class looking at social determinants of health as well as the research. So their theory is a non-ideal theory, and it affirms that human beings don't exist as sort of abstract individuals, but people who have real challenges that they must confront. So the theory is very practical. It's geared towards solving real public issues that we are all confronting. And it's also very important for a theory to be non-ideal, right? To have non-ideal theories of justice, because the rule of law and legal and political institutions are not scale blind, right? And I'll explain what that means. The Yale legal scholar Daniel Markovits talks about, he says that it's incorrect to suppose that an average person, for instance, enjoy the same rights and obligation or have the same obligations to the law as, say, a very wealthy person or corporation, right? He says it's incorrect to assume that people are treated equally under the law, because in the actual world, right? Whereas middle class people, for instance, have to be law abiding, right? the people who are on the highest level of social class, the social elites in our time, they have teams of lawyers and workers and experts to help them get away from the law, right, for accountability to law. So whereas average people don't have the benefit of a team of lawyers working on your behalf to help you, say, avoid taxes and so on, the elites do. So then the laws, even though supposedly they're supposed to treat everyone equally, is not scale blind, right? It does have that difference because of the social condition, the concrete social conditions. So society should be structured. Society is structured, right? In fact, to empower the powerful to resist legal accountability. So the rule of law is, again, not scale blind. So in order to evaluate the situation of whether or not a system of law is actually just, we need to look at the actual outcomes of how laws are applied and enforced in a particular situation. We can't just think about justice in the abstract. We have to look at the realities too. So in addition, society is also implicated by racial, gender, and class fault lines, right? That, as we will see in the next few weeks, inequalities tend to have a cumulative effect on human well-being. So one kind of inequality can combine with other kinds of disparities, which would worsen a person's opportunities to flourish. So for instance, a person who is both poor and discriminated against based on his race would see the health outcomes worse than if you only experience one of those two things, right? So socioeconomic status can work together with racial discrimination, for instance, to make somebody's health worse. So this in turn will make that same person poorer and less likely to flourish, or even to be able to cope with a serious illness, right? There are a number of problems that make Rawls's theory unattractive to powers and Faden. Among them is the assumption that that people are roughly equal in capabilities and circumstances in society. And then secondly, Rawls tend to also focus, when it comes to distributive justice, on wealth and resources, and not on the ability of each person to translate resources into real opportunities, right? So giving everyone, for instance, a certain amount of cash does not mean that they will translate into real opportunities, right? Because to translate resources into opportunities requires sometimes education, expertise, and experience, and things like that, and help. So we need to also focus on, in terms of justice, whether or not people have the ability to translate resources into real opportunities. So Powers and Faden both agree with Rawls, though, that basic social structures of society is the concern of justice, right? So justice concerns how social and political institutions are organized. It refers to the laws, the norms, and the customs, for instance, that govern institutions like the family, like educational institutions, like economic institutions, as well as our political discourse. And it also concerns our culture, right? Such as a culture of stigma related to mental health in many cultures can undermine a society's mental health. Every one of these things can present obstacles to human well-being, and so theories of justice must examine these things critically. There are, of course, also other kinds of theories of justice, and among them, famous among them, is utilitarianism, right, which is one of the most prominent options still alive today. Utilitarians such as traditionally John Stuart Mill believe that morality can basically be reduced to one supreme moral value, which is sometimes referred to as utility, or happiness as a state of mind, right? So decisions, whether by governments or individuals, are moral and just insofar as they maximize happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, can you think of some problems with this, right? There are many criticisms against utilitarianism, and among them is its inability to protect the rights of minorities and vulnerable people, right? And utilitarianism also finds it difficult to distinguish, say, between good kinds of pleasure versus bad kinds of pleasure, right? So those are sort of the two traditional criticisms leveled against utilitarianism. But then again, utilitarianism is still alive today because they are able to adapt to different social needs. And so we will talk about a newer version of it in a little bit. So many economists and political theorists today prefer the version of utilitarianism called the preference satisfaction account, right? The preference satisfaction model of utilitarianism. Now, this could take different forms, but generally, economists tend to favor preference satisfaction as a principle of social institutions, right? While many other theories favor what's called the equal preference satisfaction. Doesn't matter which option one chooses. There are a number of potential issues, namely, which preferences count, whose preferences count, right? For instance, is access to expensive wine on par with basic nutrition for children who are in poverty, right? So that society should be designed to honor sort of children's nutritional needs and not the desire to have expensive wine, for instance, right? Another question is our mental states the only thing that matters, right? What about our human agency? Now, another problem is that preferences can be hijacked by gross inequality, right? There's a lot of evidence that shows preferences can be manipulated by social conditioning and systemic oppression, right? So that if we're going to the mission of society is to maximize options and preferences, we need to be sensitive to the fact that preferences change and they can be manipulated and reshaped, right? And one important example is after the Great Bengal famine in 1944, public health officials surveyed a place near Calcutta, right? One of the hardest hit places by the famine. And the hardest hit people were, according to research, widows who lacked both social status and a steady source of income. However, only about 2.5% of the widows ranked their health as ill compared to 45.6% of widowers. Right? So this phenomenon is called, it's come to be called adaptive preferences, right? When people are deprived of something or are told not to desire something, say, you're told not to be educated as a woman, for instance, right? Eventually, you will learn those preferences. You will adapt new preferences in order to suit your social context. And so when you're deprived of something or conditioned to not desire something, then you wouldn't your preferences will be influenced, right? So because of adaptive preferences, a lot of people think utilitarianism is really not a good way to measure the well-being of a people in our society. So the limits of utilitarianism sort of underscores the practical relevance of having a pluralistic approach to dimensions of human well-being, so that you're not reducing it to just pleasure or happiness or even just preferences, right? So Powers and Faden prefers an approach that takes our state of being, such as being well-nourished and having bonds of solidarity and being respected, just as seriously as the ability to exercise freedom and to achieve certain capabilities with our own efforts, right? So in short, well-being is a product of both our agency as well as the environment within which we find ourselves. Agency speaks to our individual initiative and responsibility, while the environment implicates the design of basic social institutions on which we all depend and on which we all have obligations to support. So, but too many accounts of justice merely just focus on either one or the other. But in order for the list of dimensions of well-being to become requirements of justice, that is to say, basic social structures have to support them. HLA Hart argues they must fulfill three criteria. One, they must be needed by everyone, and they must be against everyone, meaning that everyone has a duty to support. And three, they're irrespective of differences in individual ends or projects. Powers and Faden believe that they fulfill all three requirements because these basic dimensions of well-being are not only things that everyone can be presumed to want, they're compatible with a plurality of life plans, right? But they're also, more importantly, necessary for everyone to achieve a basic level of human flourishing, right? And then secondly, these basic dimensions of well-being, they all depend in one way or another on larger social institutions that everyone is responsible of supporting. So for these reasons, Faden and Powers believe that they have put forward a very compelling account of social justice, where I think they're really onto something here. So that's basically it for today. I hope that today's discussions have helped you understand a little bit more about what theories of justice are and what they're supposed to do, as well as introduce you to one compelling account of how to think about justice issues in our society. Next week, for the next session, we will continue to talk about these things to enhance our understanding of social justice issues by relating these principles to the empirical situation we'll be examining in terms of social determinants of health. So thank you.